Today we will discuss one of the most relevant and interesting topics, the economic miracle that made China one of the world leaders. In the lifetime of many of us, the term "made in China" has gone from being a mockery to being commonplace. But how did this happen? Is it true that China owes its entire development to the United States? What does Hong Kong have to do with it, and was there really an economic leap? We will cover all of this and more in the next couple of minutes in the Leap of the Steel Leader. To begin with, let's go back to the end of World War II. This is rarely mentioned, but China suffered terrible losses during the conflict, more than 15 million, and by some estimates up to 30 million people. Just to put that into perspective, it's several times more than the combined losses of the United Kingdom, Poland, the United States, Italy, Hungary, Austria, and France. Additionally, the country was subjected to some of the worst wartime atrocities: the widespread use of chemical weapons, the massacre of entire cities, and secret squads conducting experiments on Chinese citizens. This is a topic for a separate video. For now, it's important to remember that the country was in a dire state. Almost immediately after Japan's surrender in China, the civil war between the communists and the nationalists, GMD, resumed. It's worth noting that there was no respite for the Chinese until 1950, as after the nationalist retreat to Taiwan, the Chinese communists turned their attention to Tibet, formally annexing it in 1951. In the subsequent 2 years, massive purges took place which, according to experts, claimed the lives of 2 million people. The Communist Party only focused on governing the country after resolving territorial, dissident, and partisan issues. The old and familiar Mao Zedong led everything under the guidance of the USSR. Taking a page from their neighbor's playbook, Mao initiated the first 5-year plan in 1953. It's important to understand that at that time, China was still a primarily agrarian country with a very poor population that had experienced nearly 2 decades of constant warfare. There was no talk of a leap, even in theory. The main goal of the first 5-year plan was to catch up to what Western countries and even the USSR had already achieved. It was about laying the foundation for industrialization, establishing basic factories, and developing industry. They built 595 factories and other construction projects, with the USSR assisting in the construction of around a third of them. In general, the first 5-year plan was considered successful by the Chinese. In just 5 years, they produced more steel than in the 50 years prior. The GDP of the industry doubled. However, it's important to remember that percentages and economic indicators are relative. If you have $1 and someone gives you another dollar, your capital has increased by 100%. But for some reason, you're not richer. The same can be said for the first 5-year plan. It was a breakthrough for the exhausted Chinese, but there was no talk of an economic miracle. Furthermore, after 5 years, agriculture had hardly progressed in development. Remember this fact, because we will come back to it. Now, let's move on to the second 5-year plan. Before it, China faced a classic global problem. The United States didn't like China getting closer to the USSR. NATO essentially declared economic isolation from China. Things weren't smooth on the military front either. In 1954, the communists attempted to take Taiwan by force, and the United States even considered using nuclear weapons. In the end, Taiwan lost a couple of islands, and China focused on development. Inspired by the successes of the first 5-year plan, they developed a plan for the second one. It logically continued the first, emphasizing heavy industry and, for once, paying attention to agriculture. But in 1958, just before the start of the 5-year plan, China abandoned the use of Soviet experience. Mao made a mistake that cost tens of millions of lives. He rushed and declared not an ordinary 5-year plan, but the so-called Great Leap Forward. The communists believed they could catch up with the West in the shortest possible time, not through professionalism, but through the sheer enthusiasm of the people. Nikita Khrushchev promised to catch up with and surpass America, and Mao to keep up, challenged Britain even though there were no production capacities. Despite having 700,000 backyard steel furnaces, they couldn't produce good quality steel in them in a year. What's even worse, they recruited peasants as labor for industry. Untrained and exhausted from working in the fields, they had to melt steel. And on top of that, the war against sparrows descended upon them. By briefly killing 2 billion birds, the Chinese unleashed an uncontrollable army of insects. In a commune with peasants pulled from the fields, this led to a terrible famine. Communist Party archives state that approximately 45 million peasants died of hunger from 1958 to 1962. In general, the 5-year plan, to put it mildly, failed. 1/3 of the GDP was lost, a huge amount of the population, and what saved China from disaster was the fact that they eventually abandoned the Great Leap Forward. albeit belatedly. Later, Mao publicly admitted his mistakes, but it didn't help the country much. China was still 90% agrarian, and in the meantime, they lost several years while fighting sparrows. So they approached the third five-year plan more cautiously and only began it in 1966, parallel to the Cultural Revolution. The government finally remembered agriculture and lowered its ambitious goals for economic growth. However, what was happening in the background was even more crucial. This was when the final rupture in relations with the USSR was unfolding. Before that, despite disagreements, communism stood united against capitalism. The USSR and China remained on the same side in Korea, Vietnam, and other proxy conflicts. However, the USSR's policy of peaceful coexistence with capitalism contributed to the rift. The Chinese-Indian conflict, where the Soviets did not support China, also added fuel to the fire. In 1969, the USSR and China were on the brink of war when they engaged in armed confrontation on Damansky Island. This is an excellent example of historical irony, as the outcome of the rift, which began because the USSR wanted peaceful coexistence with the USA, led to closer ties between China and the USA. This is when the countdown to the beginning of the economic miracle begins, but we would like to draw your attention to something else: what China was like before the era of open-door policies. By 1978, China's per capita GDP was less than $200 per year, which in today's money is 50 times less than in the USA. At that time, China's population had already exceeded 1 billion, and approximately 90%, according to simple economic indicators, were still living not from paycheck to paycheck, but from rain to sunny days. Remember our example of 100% wealth growth when you initially had $1. China was an extremely poor country with a primitive economy by global standards. But on December 15, 1978, U.S. President Jimmy Carter announced the resumption of diplomatic relations with China. This followed ping-pong diplomacy, the exclusion of Taiwan from the UN, and numerous hints, behind-the-scenes intrigues, and secret meetings. From that moment on, the conflicting sides turned into partners. Often, this date is considered the beginning of the economic miracle. The figures are truly staggering. The average annual economic growth rate was in the double digits, and in 1984, it even reached 15%. Usually, without going into details, people simply claim that the US came to China for cheap labor and lifted it from ruins. But in reality, the devil is in the details, and the actions of the Chinese government played a decisive role. Deng Xiaoping reduced the role of the state in the economy. Under Mao, almost 90% of production was controlled. His successors softened the policy, and it was they who allowed Western investors to enter the market, where a 10-digit number of free workers was ready to toil for pennies. Additionally, they had almost no human rights organizations and no one regulating labor conditions. Whole factories in the USA were disassembled for spare parts and transported to China. A notable example is the Baogang Corporation. In chemistry, there is a term known as rare earth elements. These are 17 elements on the periodic table, with less common names like neodymium, yttrium, scandium, and so on. They are essential for the modern world with its gadgets and green energy. However, the extraction of these metals is often dirty and harmful to the environment. But China has long sought to become a leader, and almost all of Baogang's factories were created either based on Japanese or American designs. There are even rumors that at one point, they transported an entire factory from California to the largest deposit in Bayan-Obo in northern China. As a result, China once provided up to 97% of the world's consumption of rare earth elements because, at the time, labor in China was incredibly cheap and nobody cared about the environment. This country of economic wonders is beyond doubt. However, let's not forget the rule of our $1 example. What happened in China from the 1980s to the year 2000 is not a miracle. It's actually the epitome of an economy catching up on what it had missed. China lagged so far behind developed countries that the everyday things that were commonplace for the rest of the world translated into massive GDP growth figures on paper, which for some reason are called a miracle. In reality, it makes sense that if you replace a peasant with a plow with a tractor, skipping 2 stages of progress, their productivity will increase. Just as if you replace a backyard furnace for smelting steel with a proper factory. What China did before the 21st century was catching up on a staggering developmental lag, as you can see from the GDP graph. If you take a closer look, you'll see that the truly insane growth began in 2000. China's GDP almost turned vertical, although the myth of the economic miracle suggests that it supposedly started 20 years before that. So, what happened in 2000? In 2000, Hong Kong and China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, happened. Hong Kong is a small island that was once a British colony and was later leased to China for 99 years. In 1997, when the lease ended, Hong Kong was returned to China. During that time, the island became one of the world's largest financial centers. When Hong Kong returned to China, it was flooded with investments. It's a mistake to say that all of China's wealth was brought in by the USA. In the total volume of investments during the era of economic growth, Americans accounted for only 8%, while 70% came through Hong Kong and ethnic Chinese. In the first 20 years of economic growth, China was just the world's factory, and its own products were a subject of ridicule. However, China's entry into the WTO and the financial markets of Hong Kong gave birth to the China we know today. So the real miracle happened only in the 21st century. This is evident from export figures that skyrocketed. As you probably know, the quality of Chinese products also improved over time, along with the standard of living of the population. At the same time, there was a significant problem. While newspapers were talking about an economic miracle, Disney, Apple, and other corporations repeatedly found themselves in scandals over the use of child labor and unbearable conditions in Chinese factories. Unfortunately, there are no miracles in the world. More often than not, the real world is more pragmatic. Corporations went to China not out of the goodness of their hearts, but for cheap labor and the opportunity to treat their workers in ways that could land them in jail in their own countries. A lot of time has passed since then, and in 2020, China declared victory over poverty. According to experts, the poorest segments of the population started earning 65% more over 20 years. Problems of inequality and a large number of billionaires still exist today, along with many other issues. Right now, a new trade war is escalating, and corporations are looking for countries where they can pay workers less than in China. For example, Apple has already opened several factories in India, which may very well face the same fate as China did in its time. These are economic questions, and we've introduced you to the history. If you enjoyed the video, we would greatly appreciate your likes and comments on the matter.